Imagine you've already survived 20 years of war. You've crossed deserts. You've waded through rivers of blood. You've watched your best friends die 3 feet away from you. You've earned your retirement. The Roman army handed you a plot of land, a pouch of gold, and told you, you're done. Go live. And then Rome came knocking again. Not with a draft notice, not with a threat, but with an offer so dangerous, so secret, so exclusive, that only the most terrifyingly capable soldiers in the entire empire were ever even asked. Most of them said yes. Who were these men? Why would anyone who had already survived Roman military service voluntarily walk back into the jaws of war? And how did Rome turn already lethal veterans into something the ancient world had never seen before and has never been fully replicated since? The answer is not just a story about soldiers. It's a story about a system. A cold, brilliant, almost inhuman system designed to manufacture the most dangerous human beings who had ever walked the earth. A system so effective that the men it produced were considered almost mythological by their enemies, by their allies, sometimes even by themselves. This is the story of the Evocati. And by the time we're done, you will understand why military historians consider them the single most underappreciated fighting force in the history of warfare, and why their blueprint still echoes in the DNA of every special forces unit on the planet today. Let's go back to the beginning. Picture Rome. Not the Rome of marble columns and senators in white togas. The real Rome. The Rome of mud and iron. The Rome of 200 BC, when the Republic was still a hungry, expanding beast devouring everything in its path. The Roman military machine was already extraordinary. The legions were disciplined beyond anything the ancient world had produced. They trained harder, marched faster, and fought longer than any army their enemies could field. The system of the legions, their structure, their tactics, their brutal training, was already the gold standard of warfare. But Rome had a problem. The more Rome expanded, the more wars it fought. And the more wars it fought, the more it needed not just soldiers, but leaders. Not just bodies to throw an enemy, but men who could think, adapt, and survive in situations where the official handbook offered no answers. Standard legionary training could produce good soldiers. It cannot produce this. What Rome needed was a class of warrior that sat above the legion, above the centurions, a force that operated in the spaces where normal military logic broke down. A force made of men who had already seen every scenario the battlefield could produce and survived all of them. Rome's answer was elegant in its simplicity. Don't build these men from scratch. Find the ones who already exist. The Roman legionary service was not a short commitment. We need to understand this before anything else makes sense. A standard term of service in the Roman legions during the Republic was 16 years of active combat duty, followed by 4 years in the reserves. By the time of Augustus and the imperial period, this had shifted to 20 years of active service, with an additional 5 years as a veteran reservist attached to the standards. 20 years. Think about what that means. A Roman recruit typically enlisted at around 17 or 18 years old. By the time he completed his standard service, he was in his late 30s or early 40s. He had marched on 3 continents. He had fought in dozens of engagements. He had seen sieges, ambushes, open field battles, naval landings, mountain warfare, desert campaigns. He had been wounded, probably multiple times. He had learned how to keep fighting while bleeding. He had learned how to navigate by stars, how to build a fortified camp in under 4 hours, how to identify the weakness in an enemy formation from 200 meters away. He knew the smell of an ambush before it happened. He knew which wounds were survivable and how to treat them in the field. He knew how to keep his men calm when everything was collapsing. He knew how hunger felt. Real hunger, not missing a meal hunger, but marching 40 miles with nothing hunger, and how to function through it anyway. He had forgotten more about warfare than most generals ever learned. And then Rome discharged him. He got his land grant, his premium militiae, his discharge bonus, which by Augustus's time was 12,000 sesterces, enough to buy a modest farm and stock it. He got his honesta missio, his honorable discharge certificate, a bronze tablet that guaranteed him citizenship rights and legal protections. He walked away, and Rome, in its cold brilliance, watched him go, and waited. Here is where the system reveals itself. Rome never fully let go of these men. The discharged veteran, the emeritus, was technically free. But Rome maintained something that most historians underemphasize: a cultural, legal, and psychological framework that kept the door open, that made the veteran feel not just able to return to service, but called to it. The word evocati comes from the Latin evocare, to call out, to summon. These were men who had been called back. And the calling was not random. It was not a desperate measure of last resort. The Evocati were a deliberate institution, a curated force assembled from the absolute finest veterans Rome had ever produced. The selection was not based on seniority alone. It was based on reputation, on known capability, on the specific skills Rome needed for a specific mission at a specific moment. A legate planning a difficult campaign might personally approach a former centurion farming land in Campania. A general about to face a technically superior enemy might seek out the 10 best former Aquilifer standard-bearers he knew of, men whose steadiness under fire had been witnessed by hundreds. The recruitment was personal. It was intimate. It was, in a word, Roman. Because Rome understood something that modern militaries often forget. The most powerful motivator for an elite soldier is not money, and it is not fear. It is being chosen, being told by someone who knows what you are, who has seen what you've done, that you are exactly the man needed for exactly this moment. The Evocati were chosen men, and being chosen meant everything. Now let's talk about what happened after the choosing, because this is where it gets extraordinary. The Evocati did not reintegrate into the standard legionary structure. They were not inserted back into the rank and file as experienced soldiers, adding seasoning to young units. They were not made into drill instructors or camp prefects. They operated as a distinct unit, a unit with privileges and a status that sat above the standard legion in ways that were both formal and deeply psychological. Formally, Evocati were exempt from most of the fatiguing duties that made up the miserable daily grind of legionary life. They did not dig latrines. They did not haul supplies. They did not stand gate watch in the middle of the night in driving rain. These were the tasks that consumed enormous energy and morale for a normal soldier. The Evocati were freed from them entirely. They also had the right to wear a specific insignia, to carry a staff, the vitus, normally the symbol of the centurionate, that marked them visually as something different, something elevated. Every soldier in the camp could see who they were. This was not an accident. Rome engineered this visibility deliberately, because the presence of Evocati in a military force served a psychological function that went far beyond their battlefield capability. Young legionaries, teenagers standing watch for the first time, terrified and cold, would see these men walking through the camp. These grizzled, calm, unhurried veterans who had seen everything and feared nothing. And the effect on morale was incalculable. You were not just fighting alongside good soldiers. You were fighting alongside men the army itself had decided were worth summoning out of retirement. But let's be very clear about one thing. The Evocati were not mascots. They were not inspirational figures wheeled out for morale purposes. They were not retired athletes doing a ceremonial lap of the stadium. They were killers. Highly experienced, strategically intelligent, brutally efficient killers who remained at the absolute peak of their physical and martial capability. And understanding why requires us to understand something about how Roman legionary service actually worked, something most people get badly wrong. The popular image of a Roman soldier is a young man, a teenager or someone in their early 20s, at peak physical condition. And yes, the recruits were young. But the Roman military system was not designed to burn through bodies and replace them. It was designed to accumulate capability over time. The longer a legionary survived, the more valuable he became, not despite his age. Because of it, the Romans understood, empirically, through centuries of experience, that the most dangerous soldier was not the fastest or the strongest. The most dangerous soldier was the one who had internalized thousands of tactical situations so deeply that he responded to threat automatically, without hesitation, without panic. Modern neuroscience calls this muscle memory and threat pattern recognition. The Romans just called it experience. And a veteran of 20 years had more of it than any young soldier could possibly match. He might be slower, he might be less explosive, but in the chaos of actual combat, where the noise was deafening, where the dust and blood made it impossible to see more than 10 feet, where men were screaming and dying all around, his calm was worth 10 men's strength. He had been here before, hundreds of times. It didn't scare him anymore. Now let's talk about what the Evocati actually did on the battlefield, because this is where the historical record gets fragmentary and where we have to read between the lines. But the lines are extraordinarily revealing. The Evocati did not function as a standard infantry unit. They were not a line of shields advancing in formation, which is what the bulk of the legions did. Their function was more specialized, more flexible, and more dangerous than that. They operated in several distinct capacities, depending on what the campaign required. The first was as a strategic reserve. In the fluid, chaotic environment of ancient battle, the side that committed its best troops first usually lost. Because once elite forces were engaged, they couldn't be redirected. They were locked in. A good Roman general held his best men back, watching the battle develop, identifying the crisis point, the moment when the line was about to break, when the enemy's flanking maneuver was about to succeed, when one more push at exactly the right place would turn a bloody stalemate into a decisive victory. The Evocati were that reserve. They were the men a legate looked at when he turned to his aide and said, "Now." And when they moved with the absolute confidence of men who had done this before. Not nervously, not tentatively, with the grinding, purposeful efficiency of a machine that knew exactly what it was designed for. The second function was as shock troops in the most genuinely dangerous scenarios, situations where standard legionary tactics were insufficient. Storming a heavily fortified position, breaking a disciplined enemy phalanx that had repulsed 2 or 3 standard assaults, conducting a night raid on an enemy commander's headquarters. For these missions, you needed men who could function in high chaos without losing their decision-making capability. You needed Evocati. The third function, and arguably the most strategically significant, was as advisors, subcommanders, and force multipliers. Evocati were distributed through a force, not just as fighters, but as experience nodes. A unit led by an Evocatus fought differently than an equivalent unit without one. He knew how to position a man. He knew when to push and when to hold. He knew which order from above was suicidal and had the standing and the credibility to say so out loud. In modern special forces terminology, we would call this an advisory role, embedding experienced operators with less experienced units to dramatically increase their effectiveness. The Romans invented it 2,000 years ago. Let's slow down and get specific, because the power of the Evocati system becomes clear when you look at the individual man inside it. Consider a specific, realistic profile. A Roman veteran we will call Marcus, not a real historical figure, but a composite drawn from what the historical record tells us about who these men were. Marcus enlisted at 17, born in a farming family in Samnium, in central Italy, in the 2nd century BC. He had no money and no prospects. The legion offered both. He passed the initial physical examination, probatio, and was assigned to a cohort in a legion operating in the eastern Mediterranean. His first battle was terrifying. He vomited the night before. He could not eat. His hands shook as he buckled his armor. The veteran next to him, a 15-year man named Gaius who had a scar running from his ear to his jaw, looked at him and said nothing. Just put a hand briefly on his shoulder. That was it. In the battle itself, Marcus remembered almost nothing clearly. He raised his shield when he was supposed to. He threw his pilum when the order came. He drew his gladius. He pushed. He stabbed. He pushed again. When it was over, he was covered in blood, some of it his, and was surprised to find himself still standing. He had survived his first engagement, and something changed in him that day. Not in the way stories romanticize it, not some heroic transformation. It was smaller than that, and much more important, the fear was still there. But underneath the fear, something new had appeared. A baseline. He now knew what it felt like. He knew he could function through it. His body had been in this situation and had not shut down. That knowledge was irreplaceable, and it could not be taught. It could only be earned. Over the next 20 years, Marcus earned it again and again. He fought in Hispania, in North Africa, in Greece, in Anatolia. He rose to the rank of Optio, second in command of a century. He survived 3 serious wounds. A spear thrust to the left shoulder in his 6th year, a sword cut across the ribs in his 12th, and a sling stone that fractured 2 fingers on his right hand in his 17th. He learned to write because the army required paperwork even in the field. He learned Greek because most of the Eastern Mediterranean spoke it. He learned to read terrain like a map. He learned the psychology of the enemy in each theater, the different fighting styles, the different weaknesses, the different ways different cultures broke under pressure. By year 20, Marcus was 41 years old. His joints ached in cold weather. His left shoulder didn't move quite right. He had a slight hearing loss in his right ear from years of close quarters fighting in enclosed spaces. And he was, by almost any objective measure, one of the most dangerous human beings alive. When Marcus received his discharge, he took his land grant and went back to central Italy. He found a woman. He planted crops. He repaired his house. He slept in a real bed for the first time in 2 decades. For about 6 months, it was wonderful. Then it started to become something else. The historical record is not rich with first-person psychological accounts from Roman veterans. This is not the age of memoirs and therapy. But what we can reconstruct from scattered references, from letters, from legal documents, from the accounts of writers like Livy and Polybius and later Vegetius, paints a picture that is achingly recognizable to anyone familiar with veteran psychology in any era. The farm was quiet, too quiet. The rhythms of civilian life, planting, harvesting, mending, the slow rotation of seasons, felt profoundly alien to men who had organized their entire existence around the rhythms of the Legion. Dawn assembly, morning drill, afternoon march, evening fortification, the constant purposeful motion of military life, its rigid structure, its absolute clarity about what you were supposed to be doing at every moment of every day. Without that structure, some men thrived. They were glad to be done. They embraced the farm and the family and the ordinary human pleasures they had deferred for 2 decades. But many did not. Many found that the skills they had accumulated, the skills that made them extraordinary, that had kept them alive and kept their men alive through 2 decades of sustained violence, had almost no application in peacetime. You couldn't use tactical pattern recognition to improve your barley yield. Your ability to read an enemy formation didn't help you negotiate with a grain merchant. They were extraordinarily capable men in a context that had no use for their extraordinary capabilities. And then Rome knocked on the door. The summons came in different forms depending on the era. In the Republic, it might come from a general who remembered a specific soldier from a specific campaign. I need Marcus of the Samnite cohort. I remember what he did at the walls of Corinth. Find him. In the imperial period, the institution became more formalized. The Evocati Augusti, the Evocati of the emperor specifically, were a standing unit attached to the imperial household and the Praetorian Guard structure. They were a permanent body of recalled veterans who served as the most experienced, most capable, and most trusted fighting force at the emperor's direct disposal. But whether the summons came from a Republic legate or an imperial Caesar, the experience of receiving it was probably very similar. A man came to the farm, a military man or a former military man, recognizable by his bearing, by the way he stood, by the way he looked at Marcus with the evaluating eyes of someone who had seen combat and was assessing whether the man in front of him was still the soldier he was looking for. There was a conversation, and in that conversation, the offer was made, not framed as a recall, not framed as an obligation, framed as a request, as a recognition. We need you specifically, not a soldier. You. The pay was significant. Evocati received double the standard legionary pay rate, and were entitled to a share of campaign spoils that put them in the officer class economically. The privileges were real. The status was unambiguous. But the most powerful thing on offer was not the money or the status. It was the chance to be, again, exactly what they were. Let's talk about what the reintegration looked like, because this is a piece of the system that reveals Rome's almost supernatural understanding of human psychology. The Evocati were not simply plugged back into the military machine. They were given time. Time to remember. Time to rebuild the physical conditioning that had softened slightly in retirement. Time to recalibrate to military rhythms. Rome understood that even for the most capable veteran, the transition back to operational readiness was not instantaneous. Training for recalled veterans was different from basic training in important ways. It was not about building skills from scratch. It was about activating skills that had gone dormant, like restarting a sophisticated machine that had been in storage. You didn't need to rebuild it, you just needed to clear the rust and run it through its paces. For most Evocati, this reactivation period was measured in weeks, not months. Because the fundamental truth about elite physical and tactical training is that the body and mind retain it at a level that basic skills do not reach. Psychologists call this the phenomenon of overlearned behavior. Actions that have been practiced so intensely and for so long that they bypass conscious processing entirely and operate at the level of reflex. A soldier who had 20 years of gladius drill did not need to think about how to handle his sword in a melee. The movement patterns were embedded at a neurological level that didn't erase with age. He might be slightly slower than a man 20 years younger, but he would be vastly more precise, vastly more efficient with his energy. And he would never, ever panic. Because panic, at its neurological core, is what happens when the brain encounters a situation it has no reference framework for. The Evocati had reference frameworks for everything. Let's pull back to the strategic level for a moment, because the brilliance of the Evocati system is most visible from altitude. Rome was, at its peak, administering and defending an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. The logistical challenge alone was staggering. The military challenge was existential on a continuous basis. There was always a frontier under pressure, always a rebellion to suppress, always a foreign power probing the edges. To address this, Rome had the legions, approximately 30 of them at peak imperial power, each comprising around 5,000 men. That's roughly 150,000 legionaries, supported by approximately an equal number of auxilia, non-citizen allied troops. This was a massive force, but it was spread extraordinarily thin across an empire of 2 million square miles. In this strategic environment, the quality of individual units mattered enormously. A single well-led, experienced unit could accomplish what 3 or 4 poorly led units could not. The force multiplier effect of elite capability was not just tactical, it was strategic. It determined whether a frontier held or broke, whether a rebellion was suppressed in weeks or years, whether an invasion force was defeated at the border or was allowed to penetrate deep into Roman territory. The Evocati were Rome's strategic force multiplier. Deployed to the right place at the right time, a unit of recalled veterans could change the outcome of an entire campaign. Not just a battle, a campaign. And Rome knew exactly where they were, because Rome kept records on everyone. The military administrative apparatus of the Roman legions was extraordinary for its era. Service records, performance evaluations, medical assessments, discharge documents. The Romans knew which veterans had served where, for how long, under which officers, in which engagements. They knew who had been decorated and for what. They knew who had been disciplined and why. When a legate needed specific capabilities, he could identify the specific men who possessed them. This was not random. This was a system. Speaking of systems, let's talk about the physical realities of what these men had endured to reach the point of being valuable enough to recall. The Roman legion marched, constantly, relentlessly. The standard route march pace was 20 Roman miles per day, roughly 18 modern miles, or about 29 kilometers, in full kit. Full kit. Let's be specific about what that meant. The standard legionary marching load in the imperial period was approximately 45 to 60 pounds. This included personal armor, the iconic Larica segmentata, segmented plate, or the earlier Larica hamada, chainmail, which alone weighed 15 to 20 pounds. Add the helmet, the shield scutum, the 2 javelins, pilum, the short sword gladius, the dagger, Pugio, a personal pack containing 3 days of food rations, cooking equipment, a portion of the tent, entrenching tools, and personal equipment. 45 to 60 pounds, 18 miles a day, in summer heat, in winter cold, in rain, on mountain roads, through river crossings across desert terrain. 4 days at a stretch, and at the end of each day's march, the Legion did not simply stop and sleep. They constructed a fortified camp. Every single night, a rectangular enclosure defined by a ditch, fossa, dug by the soldiers themselves, with a rampart built from the excavated earth, sharpened stakes planted along the rampart's top, and gates guarded by armed sentries. The construction of this camp was mandatory. It was not optional in mild conditions or skipped when the men were tired. It happened every night because the moment a Roman army stopped moving and lost its defensive fortification, it became vulnerable, and Roman discipline did not permit vulnerability.
The same year the empire ended, the grain ships stopped coming. The free bread that had fed the city for 5 centuries simply did not arrive one morning. No announcement, no explanation. The Romans just woke up hungry, and nobody told them why.
A 20-year veteran had done this approximately 6,000 times. His body was not soft. His body was a machine built by 6,000 repetitions of the hardest physical labor a human being can endure, and then built further by the actual fighting. The brutal, close quarters, weight-bearing, explosively violent work of Roman combat, which demanded not just endurance, but the specific kind of explosive power and coordination that only comes from years of actual combat training. The Romans did not separate fitness training from combat training. They were the same thing. The drills, the endless, repetitive, exhausting weapon drills that occupied hours of every day, were simultaneously conditioning the body and programming the mind. A legionary's daily schedule looked something like this. Before dawn, wake, break camp, equipment inspection. The Optio walked the line, checking every piece of kit. Missing equipment was punished. Damaged equipment was noted. Everything had to be in order before anyone ate. Morning, march. Route march at the standard pace, in formation, in full kit. Conversation was possible, but formation was maintained. A soldier who fell behind faced consequences. Midday, brief halt. Water. A small amount of food. Then continue. Afternoon. If not marching, weapons drill. The Romans trained with wooden practice weapons heavier than the real thing. A rudis that weighed twice as much as an actual gladius, a practice shield proportionally heavier. The theory was simple. Train harder than you fight, and fighting becomes easier. Hours of this. Footwork, attack patterns, defense patterns, combination sequences. Over and over. Evening, camp construction, then evening meal, then guard rotations through the night. Typically 4 watches of 3 hours each, rotated through the cohort. Sleep, 6 hours at best, often interrupted by guard duty, sometimes interrupted by enemy action. This was not a week of training. This was the rhythm of years. The Evocati had lived inside this rhythm for 2 decades. When they came back, it wasn't just their fighting skills that Rome was recovering. It was everything that 20 years of this schedule had made them into. Now let's go deeper into the psychological landscape. Because the most extraordinary thing about the Evocati is not what they could do with their bodies. It's what they could do with their minds. Modern military psychology has spent decades studying what distinguishes elite operators from standard soldiers. The physical differences are real, but surprisingly small. Elite units are not dramatically stronger or faster than well-trained regular forces. What distinguishes them is cognitive. Specifically, the ability to make accurate decisions under conditions of extreme stress, time pressure, incomplete information, and physical exhaustion simultaneously. This ability is not a personality trait. It is a skill, and like all skills, it can be developed. And like all skills, It develops most powerfully through actual practice in actual high-stakes conditions. There is no simulation that fully replicates this. The Evocati had practiced it for 20 years, in real combat, under real consequences, facing real death, making real decisions, and living or dying based on whether those decisions were correct. By the time a man had done this for 20 years, his decision-making under fire operated differently than a less experienced soldier's. Not just better, structurally differently. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational analysis, of deliberate thinking, becomes the bottleneck in crisis decision-making for inexperienced soldiers. They freeze, or they act randomly, because their rational brain is trying to process too much information too fast. Inexperienced warriors, decision-making in familiar threat patterns migrates to deeper, faster brain structures. It becomes pattern matching rather than analysis, recognition rather than calculation. The Evocati recognized everything. They had seen every formation the enemy might use. They had seen every terrain type and understood its tactical implications. They had seen what happens when a flank is exposed, when a supply line is cut, when leadership collapses in the middle of a battle. They had seen what works and what doesn't, not in theory, but in practice under fire with real consequences. This is what made them genuinely exceptional. Not their muscles, their pattern library. Let's talk about a specific historical moment that illuminates exactly how the Evocati functioned in practice. The year is 49 BC. Rome is tearing itself apart. Julius Caesar, fresh from 9 years of brutal campaigning in Gaul, the conqueror of an estimated 300 tribes and the man responsible for perhaps 1 million deaths, has crossed the Rubicon River with his army. This act is treason by the laws of the Republic. It is civil war. On the other side, Pompey the Great, with the full formal backing of the Roman Senate, commanding forces that nominally outnumber Caesar's. Caesar had the 10th Legion, his most experienced, most decorated, most loyal fighting force. Men who had been with him through the worst years of the Gallic Wars. Men who had stood their ground against Vercingetorix at Alesia. Men who had seen things that would have broken ordinary soldiers. But Caesar had something else too. He had his Evocati, veterans of previous campaigns who had been discharged and then recalled specifically for the Civil War. Men whose loyalty was to Caesar personally, not to the abstract republic that now arrayed itself against him. Men who understood that what was about to happen was not a standard military operation, but a political and military crisis of a kind that required exceptional judgment and exceptional steadiness. At Pharsalus in 48 BC, the decisive engagement that effectively ended the Civil War, Caesar's forces faced a Pompeian army that had significant numerical advantages. Pompey had approximately 47,000 men against Caesar's roughly 22,000. The battle turned on exactly the kind of moment the Evocati were built for. Pompey's cavalry launched a flanking attack against Caesar's right wing that was, on paper, overwhelming. His horsemen outnumbered Caesar's cavalry by a significant margin and were pushing them back. If the flank collapsed, Caesar's entire line would be enveloped and destroyed. Caesar had anticipated this. Hidden behind his cavalry, waiting, were 6 cohorts of his best infantry, experienced veterans, steady, disciplined, and commanded by officers who would not flinch. When a moment came, they advanced against the cavalry, not in the standard formation, not with the standard tactics, but using their javelins as thrusting spears, targeting the horses' faces. It was an improvised tactic, unconventional, requiring the kind of initiative and adaptability that only deeply experienced soldiers could execute under pressure. Pompey's cavalry broke, and with it the battle. Caesar won Pharsalus. He won the Civil War. He became dictator. The entire trajectory of Western civilization shifted because of a battle won partly by men experienced enough to execute an unconventional tactic under fire without hesitation. Were those specific cohorts Evocati? The record does not say definitively, but they had the signature of men shaped by the Evocati system. Steady under pressure, capable of improvisation, trained to think rather than just to execute. The institution became most formally structured under Augustus, the first Roman emperor and the man who, more than anyone, transformed Rome from a war machine republic into an administratively sophisticated empire. Augustus was deeply interested in the question of loyalty. He had come to power through civil war. He had seen what happened when military loyalty was uncertain. He had watched men like Mark Antony command forces whose commitment was conditional, situational, negotiable. He did not want negotiable. The Evocati Augusti, the imperial Evocati, were Augustus's answer to this problem. They were attached to the imperial household. Their loyalty was to the emperor personally. They received their pay directly from the imperial treasury rather than through the normal military chain of command. They were present at important ceremonies. They served as a visible demonstration of imperial power and, more subtly, as a backstop against the kind of internal political violence that had nearly destroyed Rome during the civil wars. But they were also genuinely operational. They accompanied the emperor on campaigns. They provided close protection in politically sensitive situations. They served as the core of imperial strike forces when a rapid, reliable, highly capable unit was needed without the complications of deploying an entire legion. They were, in modern terminology, something between a special forces unit and a presidential security detail, with one crucial difference from anything we might imagine today. Every single one of them had proven himself in actual sustained combat over decades of real warfare. There were no desk jobs in their history, no ceremonial roles in their past. Every Evocatus attached to the imperial household had been, at some point, a standard legionary standing in the mud under spear fire, making decisions that determined whether he and the men around him lived or died. Augustus knew this. He valued it. He cultivated it, because what the Evocati gave him was not just military capability. It was unimpeachable credibility. In a world where the respect of soldiers was the foundation of power, being surrounded by men who had actually done the hardest things and had been chosen above all others for what they had done was a form of political capital that no amount of money or ceremony could replicate. Now let's zoom out and put the Evocati in context. History is full of elite military units. Every major civilization that developed a sophisticated military eventually developed some version of an elite tier. The Spartans, the Macedonian companions, the Persian immortals, the medieval knights, the Ottoman janissaries, the English longbowmen, and in the modern era, the full spectrum from the SAS and Delta Force to the Russian Spetsnaz and Israeli Sayeret-Matkal. What makes the Evocati unique? Several things, and they are worth examining carefully. First, most elite units in history were elite because of selection and specialized training that started early. The Spartans began training their warriors at age 7. The janissaries were taken as children and raised inside the military system. The early medieval knights were embedded in military culture from childhood. These systems worked by inserting young people into a specialized developmental environment and optimizing them from the start. The Evocati worked differently. Their elite status was not the product of early specialized training. It was the product of sustained experience at the highest level of conventional military service. They were elite precisely because they had done what everyone else did, but for longer, under harder conditions, and had survived. This distinction matters because it means the Evocati represented something genuinely scalable. You didn't need an entire childhood socialization system to produce them. You just needed to maintain the standard legionary system at a high enough quality for long enough, and then be smart enough to identify and retain the best of what that system produced. Second, most elite units in history were elite for a specific, narrow purpose. The Macedonian companions were extraordinary heavy cavalry. The Swiss pikemen were extraordinary in a specific defensive formation. The English longbowmen were extraordinary at range. Each of these forces had a specific tactical role that represented their peak capability, and outside that role, they were ordinary. The Evocati were generalists. Their value was not in a specific tactic or a specific weapon or a specific formation. Their value was in their comprehensive understanding of warfare. They could fight in the line. They could advise command. They could conduct specialized operations. They could train younger soldiers. They could assess terrain. They could identify enemy weaknesses that less experienced eyes would miss. They were the most expensive multi-tool in the Roman arsenal. Third, the Evocati existed within a formal institutional framework that gave them continuity across generations and across campaigns. They were not an ad hoc gathering of veterans assembled for a single purpose and then disbanded. They were a recognized category within the Roman military system, with defined privileges, defined status, defined roles. Successive emperors maintained and utilized the institution. It persisted. This institutional continuity is extraordinarily rare in military history. Elite units typically rise and fall with specific leaders or specific moments. The Evocati persisted because Rome embedded them in the military architecture itself. Compare the Evocati with perhaps their closest equivalent in ancient history, the Spartan Cryptia. The Cryptia were young Spartan warriors, not veterans, crucially, who operated in a kind of secret police/special forces hybrid role. They were sent alone or in small groups into the countryside of Laconia, armed with only a dagger, given no food, and tasked with killing helots, the slave population that outnumbered the Spartans dangerously. They operated at night, in secret, selecting the strongest and most potentially dangerous helots for assassination. This was an elite institution. It was an intimidating one. It served a real strategic function, keeping an oppressed population in terror and eliminating potential leaders of resistance. But notice what it lacked. It lacked the accumulated experience of conventional warfare. The Cryptia were trained to kill in stealth. They were not trained for the full spectrum of warfare. They had not spent decades in sustained combat, learning the 1,000 variables that a military campaign demanded. They were specialized in a specific and very narrow form of violence. The Evocati were the opposite. Their value came from breadth, not from narrowness. Or compare the Evocati with the Macedonian Hypaspists, the elite infantry of Alexander the Great's army. Extraordinary soldiers, better equipped than standard infantry, held to higher standards, capable of extraordinary things. But they were selected at youth, trained within Alexander's system from the beginning, and their elite status was partly a function of equipment and assignment rather than accumulated battlefield experience. An Hypaspist with 5 years of service was elite. An Evocatus with 5 years of service was just getting started. The depth of experience that made an Evocatus was not replicable on a shorter timeline. Let's talk about fear, because one of the things that made the Evocati uniquely valuable and uniquely psychologically unusual was their relationship with it. Fear is not simply an emotion. It is a physiological response, evolved over millions of years to help organisms survive immediate physical threats. When the brain perceives danger, it floods the body with adrenaline and cortisol. Heart rate increases. Blood shifts from the digestive system to the muscles. Vision narrows. Non-essential cognitive functions shut down. In an untrained person encountering violence for the first time, this response is overwhelming. It dominates behavior. It produces freeze, flight, or highly disorganized fight. It makes complex decision-making nearly impossible. It makes coordinated action with others nearly impossible. In a trained soldier, the response is moderated by familiarity. The brain, having experienced this physiological state many times and having learned that action is possible within it, does not flood quite as intensely. The fighter can function better than the untrained person. But in extreme situations, truly extreme, where the threat is overwhelming and the outcome is uncertain, the response can still exceed the ability to override it. In a veteran of 20 years of sustained combat, something different happens. The neurological changes associated with deep habituation to threat mean that the fear response is not just moderated, but fundamentally restructured. The brain of a deeply experienced warrior encountering danger does not respond the same way as a less experienced brain. The activation of the amygdala, the brain's alarm center, is still present, but it is no longer dominant. The prefrontal cortex maintains control. The experienced warrior remains capable of complex thought, of assessing options, of coordinating action with others, even in the middle of what would be an overwhelming experience for a less conditioned person. This is not mythological. This is documented neuroscience, and the Romans intuited it empirically without knowing the mechanism. They just knew that experienced men did not panic, and men who did not panic were worth 10 times their nominal count. Let's get back to Marcus for a moment. It's been 3 years since he took the farm. He's standing in his field, mending a fence when the rider appears on the road. He knows before the rider dismounts. Something in the bearing, the pace, the way the horse is moving. Military horse, military rider. The fear doesn't come. Something else does. Something more complicated. A sharpening, a focusing. The rider dismounts, introduces himself, explains who sent him and why. There's a campaign. There's a specific need. There's a request. Marcus says nothing for a long moment. He looks at his field, his house, the smoke from his chimney. He thinks about his wife, who will not be surprised because she knew this day might come. Who will be afraid because love makes people afraid. Who will also because she knows him, understand. He asks 3 questions, practical questions, about the campaign, about the opposition, about his role. The rider answers. Marcus nods. He goes inside. He sits with his wife for a long evening. He does not explain everything. Some things are not explainable to those who have not been there. He just sits with her. They eat together. They talk about ordinary things. In the morning, he goes to the back of the house where his kit is stored. He has maintained it. Of course he has. Not because he knew he'd be called back, but because a soldier doesn't stop being a soldier just because the army tells him to. He checks the edge on his gladius. Still good. The leather on his sandals needs work, but will hold. He puts on his armor. It fits almost exactly as it always has. The years on the farm have kept him lean. He walks out to the road. He is, again, exactly what he is. Now let's talk about the darker side. Because Rome's systems were not bloodless abstractions. They were enforced by real consequences on real human beings. The discipline of the Roman legion is one of the most famous and feared aspects of Roman military culture. And it did not become less severe because a soldier had 20 years of experience. If anything, the expectations for a veteran were higher because veterans were held to a standard proportional to their capability. An Evocatus who failed, who showed cowardice, who disobeyed a direct order, who abandoned his post, who compromised a mission, faced consequences calibrated to the magnitude of his failure and the magnitude of his former status. Roman military punishment operated on a scale. At the minor end, loss of pay, reduction in rations, assignment to degrading duties, public humiliation in front of the assembled force. In the middle, flogging, demotion, reduction in rank and privileges. At the severe end, decimation. Decimation was perhaps the most psychologically devastating punishment in the Roman military repertoire. Applied to a unit that had collectively failed, shown cowardice, surrendered without sufficient cause, mutinied, it worked as follows. The unit was divided into groups of 10 by lot. Then each group drew lots. The man who drew the marked lot was beaten to death by the other 9. Not by enemies, by his own comrades. The survivors were forced to camp outside the main camp boundary, denied normal rations, and fed barley rather than wheat. A humiliation that marked them as having forfeited their status as full Roman soldiers. For the Evocati, who had served 20 years to achieve their status, the loss of that status, before the far worse physical punishments, was perhaps the most devastating possible consequence. These were men for whom military identity was not separate from self-identity, for whom the respect of other soldiers was not one value among many, but the organizing principle of their self-understanding. To lose it in full view of the army, for a failure everyone would know about. This was existential, and Rome designed it that way. Because Rome understood that the most powerful enforcement mechanism for an elite force is not external punishment, it is internal shame. Make the men care enough about their status and their reputation that the threat of losing them drives behavior more effectively than any external sanction. The Evocati cared. The stakes extended beyond individual punishment. The Evocati were, in some campaigns, the difference between Roman success and catastrophic failure. And Rome had experienced catastrophic failures that reverberated for generations. Consider the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. 3 full Roman legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, approximately 20 to 30,000 men under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus, ambushed in the forests of Germania by a coalition led by Arminius, a Germanic chieftain who had previously served in the Roman auxilia and knew Roman tactics intimately. The ambush lasted 3 days. The legions were virtually annihilated. It was one of the worst military disasters in Roman history. When Augustus heard the news, he reportedly beat his head against a wall, crying, "Varus, give me back my legions." The legions were never replaced. The 17th, 18th, and 19th were disbanded and their numbers never reused, a form of institutional mourning almost without parallel in Roman military history. What went wrong? Multiple things. Poor intelligence, overconfidence, failure to adapt to a non-standard tactical environment. But at the core, a chain of decisions made by commanders without sufficient experience in Germanic forest warfare, combined with soldiers who had not faced an enemy capable of this kind of coordinated ambush. Arminius had studied Roman tactics for years. He knew how legions moved, how they communicated, how they responded to threat. He used that knowledge to construct a scenario that the Roman tactical playbook had no good answer for. What might have prevented it? No one can say for certain. But the lesson Rome drew from Teutoburg was one that elevated the importance of experience and adaptability above raw numbers and formal discipline. The Evocati were, in part, an institutional response to the recognition that wars were sometimes lost by commanders who had no answer for the unexpected. Men who had seen everything could at least recognize when they were in unfamiliar territory. And recognition was the first step toward survival. Let's go even deeper into the specific physical experience of what these men endured, because understanding it viscerally is what transforms them from historical abstractions into human beings who were extraordinary in ways that deserve genuine respect. The Roman military diet was functional and calculated, not comfortable, but specifically designed to sustain maximum physical output over maximum time. The primary staple was fermentum, wheat, typically consumed as bucellatum, hardtack biscuits, on the march, or as pulse, a thick grain porridge in camp. Each legionary received approximately 33 ounces of grain per day, roughly 3,000 calories, calibrated for the energy expenditure of marching and fighting. This was supplemented with salt, sal, an essential electrolyte for men sweating through long marches. The connection between salary and salt is not accidental. The word salary derives from the Latin salarium, related to the salt rations or salt money given to Roman soldiers. Additional calories came from olive oil, lentils, dried meat, or fish when available, and wine. Pasca, actually, which was sour wine mixed with water, a drink that was slightly acidic, that helped purify questionable water sources, and that provided modest caloric and psychological value. This was what sustained a marching, fighting Roman army. Now picture a 20-year veteran who has eaten this diet, with variations, with occasional abundance after victories, with occasional near starvation during bad campaigns for 2 decades, whose entire digestive system has adapted to it, whose body has learned to extract maximum utility from minimum input, who has learned exactly how much he can eat before a march to optimize his energy without the discomfort of a full stomach under physical exertion. He knew his body the way a machinist knows his tools. Every threshold, every limit, every way to push past the limit and still function. His feet were extraordinary. The Roman caliga, the military sandal, was a remarkable piece of technology constructed to distribute weight evenly and allow air circulation. with hobnailed soles that provided grip on most surfaces. After 20 years, a legionary's feet had adapted to constant march. The calluses were architectural. The musculature of the foot and lower leg was beyond what most modern people develop in a lifetime of normal activity. He could march for days in ways that would destroy someone not adapted to it. His hands, after years of daily weapons drill, years of constant manual labor on campaign, years of handling iron and wood and rope and leather, his hands were instruments of extraordinary capability and strength. He could handle his sword with a precision that no amount of casual training replicated. Not strength alone, precision. The fine motor control of thousands of hours of drill, the ability to place a blade exactly where he intended it in the middle of a fight, exactly when it needed to be there. Sleep. A veteran soldier's relationship with sleep was unlike a civilian's. He could sleep in 45-minute intervals and function. He could be pulled out of deep sleep and be fully operational in seconds. A survival adaptation that became habitual after years of night alerts, enemy raids, watch rotations. He could sleep in noise, in cold, in rain, in cramped and uncomfortable spaces, on hard ground with minimal bedding. He could be tired and still perform. That last part deserves emphasis. The ability to function under fatigue, genuine, deep, accumulated fatigue, is perhaps the most underrated military skill there is. Battle doesn't wait until everyone is rested. Decisions get made in the middle of the night after 3 days of marching. Fights happen when you've had 4 hours of broken sleep and your legs are burning and your shoulders are burning and there's nowhere to sit and nothing to eat. The Evocati had been there so many times that they had learned to operate in that state as if it were normal. Because for them it was... The weapons deserve their own discussion, because the relationship between these men and their weapons was not what most people imagine. The standard Roman gladius, the short sword that was the primary close combat weapon of the legion, was not a weapon that rewarded power. It rewarded technique. It was approximately 20 inches long. It weighed approximately 2 pounds. By the standards of ancient swordsmanship, it was a subtle weapon. You could not slash at an opponent with it effectively. The blade was too short and too straight for a clean cutting arc. You had to thrust. You had to get inside your opponent's weapon range, past his shield, and put the point into him at close range. This required moving in very close to an armed and dangerous opponent. It was technically demanding in a way that no amount of strength compensated for. What it rewarded was exactly the accumulated skill of years of drill and years of actual combat. The ability to read an opponent's body language a half second before he moved. The ability to create an opening with a shield edge or a shoulder charge and immediately exploit it. The ability to move through the chaos of a melee. Men grappling, shield slamming, men falling, and continuously find the next threat and the next opening. An Evocatus with a gladius was not strong-arming his way through combat. He was thinking his way through it. Rapidly, at reflex speed, with a library of learned responses so large and so deeply embedded that it appeared to observers as effortless mastery. And the gladius was only the beginning. The pilum, the Roman javelin, was a specialized weapon of remarkable engineering. It had a thin iron shank connecting the head to the wooden shaft. The design was deliberate. On impact with a shield, the iron shank would bend, making the pilum impossible to throw back and difficult to remove, adding weight and drag to the enemy's shield and often forcing him to drop it. Delivered in a coordinated volley by trained legionaries immediately before close combat, the pilum could strip an enemy formation of its shields before the swords even came out. A veteran understood intuitively when the pilum volley would be most effective. He understood the angles, the distance, the timing. He understood how to read a formation to identify where the volley would cause maximum disruption. Theory and practice were one for him. They had merged through repetition. Let's talk about leadership, because the Evocati's role in the command structure of a Roman campaign illuminates something important about how Rome thought about authority and experience. The standard Roman military hierarchy, Simplified. At the top, the legate legatus legionis, typically a senator with limited direct combat experience, but with political authority and strategic oversight. Below him, the tribunes, generally young men of the equestrian class, serving in a military capacity as part of their career development. Below them, the centurions, the professional combat leaders who actually ran the daily operations of the legions. The centurions were the backbone. Every history of Roman military success comes back to the centurionate. Caesar loved his centurions. Augustus structured the centurionate carefully. The centurions were the men who knew warfare, who could translate a legate's strategic objective into actual tactical action, who maintained discipline and fighting capability in the ranks. The Evocati were, in some configurations, parallel to or above the centurions in terms of functional authority. Not formal institutional authority. An evocatus did not necessarily outrank a centurion in the formal chain of command. But in terms of credibility authority, the kind of authority that exists when everyone in the room knows who the most dangerous and experienced person is, the Evocati were often at the apex. When an evocatus expressed an opinion about a tactical situation, people listened. Not because they had to, because the evocatus had been right before. Many times, in situations where being wrong had meant dying. This is a kind of authority that cannot be conferred by rank or appointment. It can only be earned, and it was, in operational terms, often more powerful than formal rank. Because in a crisis, when the formal chain of command is disrupted, when a legate is down, when the orders from above have stopped making sense, the army falls back to the person who trusts most. Not the person with the most impressive title, the person who has been here before. There's another dimension to the Evocati that rarely gets discussed because it requires admitting something complicated about the nature of violence and the men who become expert in it. The Evocati were not soldiers who have been softened by retirement and re-hardened by the recall. The retirement had not fundamentally changed what they were. 20 years of active service had shaped them at a level deeper than circumstance. The farm did not undo that shaping. The civilian life was a surface adaptation. Underneath, they were still warriors, in the best sense of that word. Disciplined, purposeful, effective, oriented toward the protection of the people and the mission they had committed to. But also in the harder sense. Men for whom violence was not alien. Not traumatic in the way it was for the uninitiated. It was work. Complex, dangerous, skilled work that demanded everything from them. But work they understood, that they were good at, that gave them a clarity of purpose that the farm did not. This is not a comfortable thing to sit with. The modern world has a complicated relationship with the idea of the professional warrior. A person for whom killing is a craft, who has practiced it for so long that it no longer carries the existential weight that it carries for most people, but is a real thing. And Rome understood it. The Evocati were valuable partly because of their skills, but they were valuable also because of their psychology. They were not men who would hesitate at the wrong moment. They were not men who would freeze when the situation demanded immediate and decisive violence. They were not men who needed to be psychologically prepared for the reality of what war was. They already knew. They had always known. And if they had demons from what they'd seen, and some surely did, because no human being who has spent 20 years in sustained warfare comes out entirely without cost. They had also learned to function despite them. They had learned, through sheer necessity, to compartmentalize in ways that allowed them to remain effective. This is not heroism. This is adaptation. This is what happens to a human being who is built to function in extreme conditions and who has spent 20 years doing exactly that. The Evocati were, in some ways, the most human and the least human people in the Roman world simultaneously. Deeply shaped by experience, capable of extraordinary connection and loyalty, and also capable of things that most humans could not bring themselves to do without catastrophic psychological cost. Rome looked at this combination and saw a resource. We've been talking about the Evocati largely in the context of the Republic and early Empire. But the institution persisted and evolved across centuries. Let's trace its arc. Under Julius Caesar, the Evocati were a tactical and political tool deployed in the specific crisis of civil war. Caesar's recalled veterans were loyal to him personally with an intensity that standard institutional loyalty could not match. They had chosen him when the choice was genuinely dangerous. That kind of loyalty was tested and confirmed rather than assumed. Under Augustus, the institution became formalized. The Evocati Augusti were an official component of the military structure attached to the Praetorian Guard. They provided the emperor with a force whose loyalty was unambiguous and whose capability was the highest available. Under the later Julio-Claudian emperors and into the Flavian and Antonine dynasties, the Evocati continued as an imperial institution. We have epigraphic evidence, inscriptions on stone, that attest to their existence, their service, their honors. Veterans who served as Evocati sometimes had their accomplishments recorded in stone, and those stones survived. One inscription from the reign of Trajan records an evocatus of the Praetorian Guard who served an additional 12 years after his initial discharge, participated in Trajan's Dacian campaigns, and received multiple military decorations. He retired for the second time, with honors that placed him in the upper tier of the Roman military aristocracy, a man who had served approximately 32 years in total, who had been retired and recalled, who had chosen to continue when he could have stopped. Why? The stone doesn't say. It doesn't need to. The inscription speaks for itself. This was a man who was exactly what he was, and who knew it, and who chose to remain it as long as Rome would have him. By the 3rd century A.D., as the Roman Empire entered its period of sustained crisis, the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire nearly collapsed under simultaneous pressure from external enemies, internal usurpers, economic collapse, and plague, the Evocati institution became increasingly important as the formal military structure became increasingly unreliable. When legionary loyalty shifted from the empire to individual generals, when emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed, when the entire command structure of the Roman military was in constant flux, the Evocati represented something stable. They were not loyal to a legion whose numbering and posting had been reshuffled a dozen times. They were not loyal to an emperor who might be dead in 3 months. They were loyal to Rome in the deep, almost spiritual sense that men who have given 20 years to something carry for the rest of their lives. Or they were loyal to specific commanders who had chosen them, who had recognized them, who had treated them as what they were. Either way, their loyalty was real and it was earned. And in a period when nothing else in the Roman military structure could be fully trusted, real earned loyalty was an extraordinary asset. Here is the full picture now. Here is the system in its entirety. Rome built an army that recruited young men and transformed them through sustained, demanding service into military professionals of the highest order. This service lasted not for one campaign or two, but for 2 full decades of continuous, intensive operation. The men who survived this service, and survival itself was a form of selection, because 20 years of Roman military service eliminated the weak, the unlucky, and the psychologically unsuitable through simple attrition, emerged as the most comprehensively capable soldiers the ancient world could produce. Rome then discharged these men, but maintained the institutional and cultural infrastructure to recall them. The discharge was real, and the privileges of civilian life were genuine. But the door was never fully closed. When Rome needed the best, not the most numerous, not the most formally trained, but the absolute best, it looked to these men. It chose them, personally, deliberately, with full knowledge of who they were and what they could do. And the men it chose, almost universally, said yes. Not because they had to, because being chosen was the affirmation that everything they had endured had meant something. The Evocati were summoned, and they answered, because Rome, for all its cruelty and its contradictions and its vast machinery of violence, knew how to honor the men it had made. And the men it had made could not, when called, be anything other than what they were. The system was not random. The system was not luck. The system was the cold, beautiful, terrible product of centuries of empirical learning about what war demanded and what it made of the men who survived it, and how to use what it made. Every detail was intentional. Every privilege was calculated. Every challenge was designed to produce a specific result in specific human beings. This was not an army. This was an institution for manufacturing a certain kind of person, and then having manufactured them for knowing what they were worth. So what happened to the Evocati? As the Western Roman Empire declined through the 4th and 5th centuries, the military system that had produced and sustained the Evocati collapsed with it. The legions became shadow forces. The discipline that had defined them for 5 centuries eroded under the pressure of constant crisis. Insufficient funding and the military reforms of the late empire that brought increasing numbers of barbarian foederati into the Roman military structure. The foederati were good soldiers, in many cases excellent soldiers, but they were not products of the Roman legionary system. They did not have the 20 years of accumulated institutional knowledge. They were not eligible for the Evocati recall in the same way. The institution that had been so powerful for so long required a specific precondition, a legionary system operating at sufficient quality and stability to produce veterans worth recalling. When that system degraded, the pool of Evocati dried up. By the 5th century, the formal Evocati Augusti had ceased to function as a meaningful institution. The military culture that had sustained them, the culture of the legion, of the march, of the fortified camp, of the daily drill, and the 2 decades of service, was gone. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, maintained elements of the professional military tradition for another 1,000 years. Byzantine military manuals from the 6th and 10th centuries describe forces that echo the legionary tradition in interesting ways. But the specific institution of the Evocati, in its republican and imperial form, was a product of a specific historical moment that could not survive the end of that moment. What did survive was the idea. Every subsequent military system that developed a concept of veteran reserves, of recalled experienced soldiers, of special forces drawn from the most experienced rather than the most recently trained. Every one of these systems is in some direct or indirect sense descended from the Roman insight that experience is not just valuable, it is irreplaceable. The SAS selection process, which prioritizes candidates who demonstrate adaptability and decision-making under stress over raw physical performance, is a descendant of this idea. The American Special Forces community's emphasis on experienced non-commissioned officers, the sergeant major who has been in the field for 20 years and whose judgment is worth more than any newly minted officer's tactical theory, is a descendant of this idea. The Israeli Defense Forces system of reservist units built around experienced veterans who can be rapidly recalled and who return to operational effectiveness faster than any newly trained soldier could be. This is a direct institutional descendant of the Roman insight. The Evocati are dead. Their idea is not. Let's return to Marcus one final time. He is in camp now. It has been 3 months since the rider came to his farm. He is in Hispania, part of a force conducting operations against a mountain tribe that has been raiding lowland settlements for 2 years. Standard pacification campaign. He has done versions of this 4 times in his career. The young soldiers around him are watching him. Not obviously, not in a way they would admit if you asked them, but they are watching. The way he moves through the camp. The way he checks the perimeter before he sleeps. The way he looks at the terrain on the morning march and says nothing for a long moment, and then says one sentence to the decurion next to him about the tree line on the North Ridge. The way that in the battle 2 weeks ago, he had moved exactly once at exactly the right moment, to exactly the right position, and the flank that was about to collapse didn't collapse. They are watching him because they know what he is. They know that he was already retired when they were still boys. That he had 20 years of this before they arrived. That he chose to come back when he could have stayed on his farm. They don't fully understand why, but they feel, in the way that young soldiers always feel the presence of genuine experience, that he is something they have not yet become. That if they survive long enough and do it right, they might one day become something like him. The man who had already done it all and chose to do it again. Not for Rome, not for the emperor, for something that has no political name, that lives below ideology and formal loyalty and all the languages that official history uses to explain why soldiers fight. He is out here because this is what he is. Because 20 years of this made him into something that the farm, however quiet and however beloved, could never fully use. Because when Rome looked at everything it had produced and chose who it needed most, it chose him. And being chosen was, is, and perhaps always will be, the deepest possible answer to the deepest possible question a person can ask themselves. Am I, in the truest sense, what I think I am? The Evocati knew the answer. They walked back through the gate to find out. So here's the question I want to leave you with. The Evocati system worked because Rome understood something that we often forget. The most powerful thing you can offer an elite person is not money, not safety, not comfort. It's the chance to be fully, completely, without apology, exactly what they are. What does that mean for us? In a world where most systems push people toward comfortable mediocrity, where the path of least resistance is always available, where the retirement and the farm and the quiet life are always easier than the march. What would it take to build an institution today that identified the people who had become genuinely extraordinary through sustained commitment and gave them the chance to be that thing fully? What would that institution look like? And who, among the people you know, would answer the call? Leave your answer below. And if you want to go even deeper into the Roman military machine, the brutal system that turned ordinary teenagers into the men the Evocati would eventually become, there's something coming about the decimation, Rome's most terrifying internal punishment, that will change how you see military discipline forever. It is not what you think it is, and it worked in ways that even Rome's enemies eventually copied. Stay with us.